This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Jenny Ifft, K-State Policy Specialist, begins today's show with information about the Farm Bill during the Great Depression. Throughout that time period, the role of the government shifted. Continuing the show is K-State Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster, discussing horsetails, jointed goatgrass, and poison hemlock. She reviews how to identify and manage these weeds, especially since certain ones could be deadly. K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk finishes today's show, encouraging farmers to take advantage of June being National Dairy Month to share their story with the community. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with a Farm Bill segment with Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flinchball Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft. Jenny, thanks for joining us once again.
Great to be here.
So we're moving forward a little bit in history now from last week, talking about the Great Depression timeframe as it relates to the Farm Bill. And so getting started, the first thing that comes to mind when I think about the Great Depression is unemployment.
Right, yeah. And so if you look back to the early 1930s, there was just a lot of suffering everywhere in the U.S. There was 25% unemployment by 1933. Because of this, you had food riots, you were having starvation deaths. You were also seeing, farms were also struggling in rural areas. You had a lot of farms had high levels of debt. There was record high levels of farm foreclosures. A lot of states actually passed a moratorium on farm foreclosures. You had over 1,000 rural banks fell in 1931. So, there was suffering on and off the farm throughout the U.S. at that time.
Definitely a very difficult time, and probably why it's called the Great Depression. And so kind of moving forward a little bit from there, we have FDR being elected in 1932.
Right. So, Hoover was the president before FDR. And, the government was taking some actions, but he still held on to that limited view of government. But because of all that suffering, public attitudes shifted. They wanted a more active role of government. FDR made those pledges, and he was elected. And then, you end up having the New Deal as well as expansion of farm programs afterwards.
And you mentioned limited government. So could you talk a little bit about what the government shift was from what Hoover had to what FDR was doing?
So generally, before FDR was elected, the prevailing view was that government doesn't provide any type of a safety net, whether that's for, addressing hunger, health care, issues that affect families, or a farm safety net, so support for farm incomes.
So an important thing, especially looking at the Dust Bowl that kind of got going around 1933.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, one thing after another for agriculture during this time. And this was in the Southern Plains, including in Kansas, across several states. And there was really, really multiple causes. So you had some overgrazing. Sometimes it was practices. And a lot of times you had plots that were really too small for a family to earn a livelihood from. So that affected their practices. It wasn't just necessarily lack of knowledge. It was a sort of economic deprivation. People were very optimistic because they had had a lot of rain, so there was this view that the rain follows the plow. And so it was really this combination of factors that just led to massive erosion, large droughts, low yields for several years.
So a lot of concerns that farmers were accidentally creating and they may not have known, which had led to some soil conservation work.
Right. So in 1935, there was legislation that passed to promote soil conservation and provide some federal government support for that. And actually, there's stories that dust was rolling into D.C. in 1935 when this bill was being negotiated. So there was a high level of awareness of what was happening in the Southern Plains. The dust literally was not contained there. It was going everywhere across the U.S.
And some more things happening in D.C. during that time. The Agriculture Adjustment Act.
So this is what I'd really think about as the first farm bill, and that was in 1933. A big part of what that did is allowed farmers to sell their crops at certain major crops, corn, wheat, and a few others, at what's called parity prices.
And so what are parity prices?
So parity prices are prices that are based on what farmers received from 1909 to 1914. So the idea was that was the golden age of agriculture. That was when farmers got a fair price for their commodities. So whatever the purchasing power of, say, a bushel of wheat was during that time, these were prices set so that wheat had the same purchasing power. So whether it's, you could think of it, however many pair of overalls is a common example, or say the same amount of fertilizer, that should be equivalent to whatever that bushel of wheat was worth in 1909 to 1914. So that was quite a bit higher than prices that farmers would have gotten on the market at that time.
So did that help boost farmers' incomes?
Yeah, no, definitely. There was a real increase in income. So they went from $115 in 1932, and they increased to over $255 after 3 years. So think about that. $255 in 1935. Obviously, there's been inflation and increases in farm income since then, but there was a substantial increase in farm income. Now, part of this, with these parity prices being paid, farmers were also being paid to reduce production. So, there was an understanding that at that time, if you pay people more for their crop without any restrictions on production, they're just going to produce more than that's needed, and then you're going to end up having the surplus. So there wasn't a recognition even then that if you're changing the prices that people receive, you're also going to change how much they produce.
And did all of these different things happening kind of fold into Supreme Court and Congress having a conversation about what each other can do?
Yeah, this was a new role for government, and the sort of laws were developing at this time. Some of these programs were being paid for by a tax on agricultural processors, which they didn't like, so it ended up in the Supreme Court. And one of their findings was that Congress can't regulate agricultural production. So that limited the implementation of this 1933 Farm Bill. And so Congress came back, and in 1936, they switched from these payments based on parity prices to payments for conservation.
From there, we've even seen kind of carry forward to our current time.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the CRP in 1985, you could see this sort of, conservation was a real problem, and farm incomes were a real problem. And this, in 1936 was a great solution to both of them. That didn't, that sort of the Supreme Court ruling didn't stay in place. So eventually USDA was able to go back to the parity price system. But for a short period of time, these payments were made through conservation payments. One interesting point with this is that the supply controls in 1936, they weren't allowed to have supply controls either. And then in 1937, you had a bumper crop. So you had this issue of oversupply of agricultural commodities again.
Which did that just create kind of a cyclical issue for farmers then with the huge crop?
Yeah. I mean, if you have a large surplus, that's going to depress prices. That could affect farm incomes. I mean, it might balance out to some degree. You have lower prices are made up for some degree by higher yields. But in the long term, those surpluses will decrease prices. And the federal government struggled with surpluses until World War II.
And talking about World War II, what was the supply of commodities during that time?
So World War II, from the perspective of an agricultural producer, really just switched things around completely. So you went to a situation of struggling with commodities to having some shortfalls and high prices because of the war, the need to support the war effort, lower crop production in Europe, so, there was food shortages in Europe. And so because of this, you shifted from the government wanting to discourage production to the government encouraging production and at the same time rationing food for consumers. So a big switch in agricultural, the focus of agricultural policy from one decade to the next.
So maybe almost a little bit of a confusing time for everything that's happening. They want more crop, they want less crop, and it just kept changing.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, again, this was completely new. You did have some of the institutions in this place before the Great Depression. You had the extension system, farm organizations were very active. You had the USDA had developed, but this kind of policy had never been implemented, so there was a lot of learning during this time, both in terms of how the government agencies did, understanding what laws or legal institutions could support it. So some programs did evolve, and some things that didn't work were abandoned.
And there were more things than just the Agriculture Adjustment Act and soil conservation things happening. What else happened?
So there were all kinds of different developments. So you did have more low-interest loans made available to farmers at that time. You had further development of the farm credit system. So, putting in place legislation that allowed for an expansion of agricultural credit. You had the formation of local soil and water conservation districts. Crop insurance started, although it remained very small for several decades. You had some marketing orders or some support for market development for specialty crops and milk. Local USDA committees, so this involvement of local producers in what the USDA did. Rural electrification was another large development. You had almost no electricity in rural areas in the 1930s, and by 20 years, most rural areas were covered. So just think about the big change in people's lives going from having electricity to no electricity.
And Jenny, is there anything else you'd like to tell people?
The role of government substantially expanded in the 1930s. And then you had the war effort, again, where there was a large role of government. You had, again, all these social changes. So just a big change in, life. And plus a lot of just really, if you think about people that lived through the Great Depression and went to World War II or supported the war effort, a lot of changes, a lot of really difficult events.
Absolutely. Jenny, I appreciate you coming on and giving us some information about the Farm Bill during the Great Depression.
Yep. Happy to be here.
That was K-State Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and an Agronomy E-Update sometimes has an article called The World of Weeds, and a contributor to that is K-State Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
So in a recent Agronomy E-Update, your World of Weeds was horsetails. And so what are horsetails?
Horsetails are kind of wild. I like to call them the dinosaurs of the plant world. They're actually a species that has been around literally since the times of the dinosaurs. And that in and of itself should tell us why I get questions about it, right? They're pretty tough critters, and they're very difficult to manage.
Something that I read in the article was it's pretty recent, and you got pictures of it asking, what is this?
Yeah, so it seems like about once or twice about this time of year, I will get questions with this picture of a plant that looks a lot like the photo that I shared for the E-Update. It's, to me, they look a lot like asparagus, actually. I don't know if that's accurate or what your listeners would think, but, they don't have any noticeable leaves. They actually reproduce by spores, not seeds. So just very, very different sorts of plants. And again, very hard to control. Our kind of go-to herbicides don't work on them.
So since the dinosaur is hard to control, how do people take care of this if they don't want it?
So there are a few herbicides that have been shown to be effective. Now, the caveat here, Shelby, is that I have not personally sprayed any of these. So I'm going based off of other folks' research here. So the other thing we need to know is that these horsetails or equisetum species tend to be found in wet areas. Okay, so if you're struggling with them in a cropping situation, one thing to think about is water management. So after that, if we're looking for herbicides that might work, there's some older data that say that you can suppress them with 2,4-D or MCPA. There's other data that says that imazapyr, picloram, or metsulfuron can be helpful at reducing them, but they're going to come back. And so it's going to take repeated herbicide applications in order to fully control them with chemistry. One of the more interesting chemistries that I have heard folks talk about controlling this is flumetzilam, which is a ALS inhibiting herbicide. The trade name there is Python. So combinations of Python and MCPA are coming recommended out of some recent research coming out of Canada. So yeah, not a lot of great herbicide options there. Fortunately, we don't find them in production fields a lot. Usually it's, something related to like a drainage or irrigation, someplace where water is going to be standing good chunks of the year.
And Sarah, I agree with you. It does look a little bit like asparagus. So if people think they might have it and it's in one of those wet areas, can they send you a picture for confirmation?
Absolutely.
And we'll include her email in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. And continuing on some fun weeds or some fun plants found around Kansas or the U.S., poison hemlock.
Poison hemlock is another one that I get questions about pretty regularly this time of year. So we did a World of Weeds article on that one. I think it was this time last year. There's two plants that look a lot alike, wild carrots and poison hemlock. They're both going to have kind of a basal rosette and kind of lacy looking leaves. One of the tells to tell them apart is that poison hemlock will actually have red speckles on the stem once it starts to bolt. Some of the other differences are really hard to distinguish, but that's one that is consistent and most folks can find. One of the things that's important about poison hemlock is, as the name applies, it's toxic. So, don't let your livestock graze it. If you have it in a pasture, you want to go ahead and take care of it. Anecdotally, I was talking with an intern in my field research program yesterday. We were traveling in south central Kansas, and we saw some at the edge of a field, kind of along a fence row, which is a good place to find it. Kind of, again, more wet areas. It's pretty shade tolerant. So we found some, and so that led to this discussion on how, generally speaking, cattle won't eat plants that are poisonous. And I guess, I don't know, again, this is not my research, but I guess there's some evidence that mama cows pass down that knowledge. So, generally speaking, we don't panic too much if we see poison hemlock. But if you're somebody who brings in cattle from out of state that wouldn't have, knowledge of this, weed management for these poisonous plants might be a little more important. Just something to think about. Not research, just something to think about. Something interesting about poison hemlock, if we're talking kind of trivia, this plant also has a long history. So it is believed that Socrates, the philosopher from before BC times, they think how he was actually killed was because someone poisoned him with, I don't know if it was powder from the plant, I don't know, but somebody poisoned Socrates with poison hemlock.
Some interesting information you have for us there, Sarah.
Not sure how practical that last part is, but something interesting.
Something that could be shown on a trivia night if someone's going somewhere to play. So poison hemlock, maybe not the biggest concern, but still something that could be taken care of. And so if producers are wanting to get it out of their area, how do they do that?
So there are some herbicides that can be used for poison hemlock. 2,4-D, glyphosate, kind of our go-tos, right, for broadleaf weeds, are both effective there. So, if you have it in a pasture setting and you want to broadcast spray, metsulfuron or Ally might be an option there as well. This one is not as challenging from a management perspective as the horsetails, but definitely can cause problems.
Poisonous hemlock, to clarify, is it poisonous to people or really just livestock?
Just don't consume it, right? It is poisonous. Now, wild carrot is not, but poison hemlock is. And so that's why a lot of times we spend a good bit of time talking about identification of those two species for pasture management types of things.
So little red dots on a plant, don't eat it.
Those reddish purple spots on the stem, stoplights, warning signs, don't go there.
And moving on now to another weed to talk about, jointed goatgrass.
So of the three we've talked about today, Shelby, this one is by far the most agronomically important. Jointed goatgrass is a winter annual, much like wheat. It actually, the relatives, the ancestors of jointed goatgrass are ancestors of hard red winter wheat that we grow here in the state of Kansas. That should tell us, right, it's going to be very challenging to control. It has the same life cycle. It has the same environmental requirements. It's a grass, so it's going to have the same sensitivities and tolerances of herbicides. So jointed goatgrass is definitely an agronomic issue for wheat producers.
Are producers only finding it in their wheat field, or could cattle producers be seeing it out in their pastures?
It's not unheard of to find something like this, maybe along the edge of a pasture, especially if your pasture borders cropland, right? one of the things that's amazing about weeds, Shelby, is that if you create a niche, they're going to fill it, right? So nature doesn't allow empty spaces, and the species that keep those empty spaces full, generally speaking, are the weeds that we try to manage. So,
And how do we manage?
Jointed goatgrass management is challenging, Shelby. Probably one of the best things to do for jointed goatgrass is to consider coaxium wheat varieties. So coaxium wheat varieties are tolerant of the herbicide quizalofop. The trade name that you need to look for there is aggressor. So that will control the grass in the grass, right? So that's one option that is important. So there's some evidence that jointed goatgrass has relatively short-lived seeds in the soil. So if you can get into a longer wheat rotation, that may be something to help with management as well. But that's one of those, suggestions that may or not be practical for a lot of folks when they think about our crop rotations. So another thing, if farmers are in a conventional tillage system, tillage can be effective at controlling jointed goatgrass, especially if you think about letting the jointed goatgrass come up and then tilling before you plant your wheat. Other things to think about, there's a little bit of evidence that says wheat stature might be a helpful cultural management tool. So, we spend a lot of time in our summer crops talking about using cultural management practices to control palmer amaranth and water hemp. But, wheat, generally speaking, is a good cultural management practice in and of itself just because of its dense growth habit, right? You don't find generally speaking, if you have a very healthy wheat crop, you don't find a lot of weeds growing in that canopy because it forms such a dense canopy, it's difficult for the weeds to compete. The last couple of years, though, we've had drought-affected wheat. It's been short. Stands have been thin. And so anecdotally have had some farmers express to me that, they haven't seen jointed goatgrass in years on their farms, but they're seeing it come back these last couple of years as the wheat canopy has presented opportunities for that weed to emerge. So yeah, jointed goatgrass is a definite problem. And I think from a herbicide management perspective, probably the best thing to think about is those coaxium wheat varieties and aggressor herbicide.
Sarah, thank you for joining us today and sharing some interesting facts, but also how to manage these weeds if people are seeing it. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster, covering horsetails, poison hemlock, and jointed goatgrass. We're going to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. June is Dairy Month. In addition to what's being done nationally to promote the dairy industry, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages Kansas producers to share their story by opening their dairy to the community, inviting 4-H clubs to tour the dairy, or asking the local grocery store if they can set up a booth to offer customers free samples.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning June and the fact that it is Dairy Month. I know many of you maybe have some activities planned centered around Dairy Month, but if you don't, I want to encourage you to share your dairy farm with some members of your local community. As you may well know, consumers view dairy farmers in high regard. You do provide a very important part of the food supply in producing raw milk on your dairy farms every day. So, it might be helpful if you could just spend a few minutes sharing your experiences as a dairy farmer with those around you as we think about June as Dairy Month. So, what are some things that you might want to do during the month of June? Well, maybe you've already got some sort of open house, or maybe you're inviting a few of your friends over for ice cream or banana splits or something like that, and share a little bit about your operation. Maybe you could invite your local 4-H club over. There's probably several in the area, and if you haven't had some 4-H'ers on the farm, maybe that would be an opportunity for you to get to know some of the 4-H families in your area and allow them to see what you actually do on your dairy, your animals, and how you produce milk and keep it safe for their food supply. Excellent way to connect with consumers is actually at the grocery store. Maybe you can plan something with your local grocer to feature a dairy product, maybe 1 week. Maybe it's some free samples of cheese, for example, that you pass out by the cheese case in the local grocery store. There's lots of different ways that we can do product tasting. It could be beverage milk, maybe even some flavored milk possibly, or even ice cream. A little harder to serve in the store, but it is a possibility that you could do that and encourage consumers to participate in Dairy Month by buying some more dairy product during the month of June. Some other things that you might think about doing is working with, your friends. Maybe you haven't really shared your dairy farm with your friends. It's an opportunity to invite them over for an evening and enjoy some time on the dairy, maybe serve some light refreshments, and just allow them to tour the farm. Many of them probably don't really understand what you do every day. Sharing your story is very important. Another way to share during the month would be on the internet. I know many of you probably do YouTubes and those sorts of things, and that's an excellent way to connect with consumers as well. Just make sure that you show the best side of your dairy as you do those things, and think about what the consumers might think about some of the things that you might find is very normal that they would not. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to engage in June as Dairy Month.
Thanks, Mike. In other news related to the dairy industry, according to the USDA's dairy forecast for next year, dairy farmers are again expected to increase output in 2024 by about 1%. Herd size, though, will be smaller, and prices expected to be down across the board. Gary Crawford has more.
More milk production, lower prices, but fairly strong margins. That's the gist of USDA's forecast for the dairy sector next year. USDA Outlook Board Chairman Mark Jekanowski says milk output seems to rise every year, of course, no matter what, and 2024, no exception.
For 2024, we're expecting an increase in production of about 2.2 billion pounds from the current year.
Or about a 1% increase. Mark says the dairy herd will be smaller. Milk per cow, though, expected to increase. Not so prices.
We're expecting product prices and milk class prices to be down just about across the board.
However, costs of feed are also projected down next year. Corn by over 25%, soybeans almost 10%. And so Mark says for next year,
the overall profitability situation for dairy farmers might still be relatively strong.
This is Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.